Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History, and it is my pleasure, as always, to welcome you to another conversation. If you're not familiar with the Gotham Center, as always, I invite you to learn more about us online, where you can find well over 1,000 essays, book reviews, event recordings, podcasts, digital exhibits, and more on all things New York City history at gothamcenter.org. Tonight, as part of our regular series featuring some of the best and most interesting new research on New York City's history, we'll be discussing this great little book from Tyesha Maddox, it's Home Away from Home, Mutual Aid, Political Activism, and Caribbean American Identity. At the turn of the last century, as most people are familiar with, immigrants flooded New York City. Roughly 40 million hit America's shores in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Most came from Eastern and Southern Europe. And to help those newcomers find jobs, housing, education, and community, mutual aid societies very soon sprang up. By now, over the last 50 years or so, those organizations and communities have been examined at great length by scholars, including some of the smaller groups that arrived, such as the Chinese, the Japanese, or Mexicans. But Caribbeans remain an exception. In part, this is because the vast majority of Caribbeans came to America after 1965. So only a few have looked at the group's earlier phase of history. The ones who did focus mainly on the Jamaican Marcus Garvey and his Black nationalist movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. But in A Home Away from Home, Tyesha Maddox recovers the many, many other institutions established by and for Caribbeans during this period between 1890 and 1940. Among other things, she finds that in America, in the face of Jim Crow, the people who came from Antigua, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Trinidad, Bermuda, the Virgin Islands, the Anglophone Caribbean, soon enough shed their nationally specific identities and began to think of themselves more as Caribbeans during a time of growing racial internationalism. I'm going to leave it there, but allow me to briefly introduce our speaker and guest this evening. Tyesha Maddox received her PhD in history from New York University in 2016. This is her first book. Before joining the faculty at Fordham University, where she is now an associate professor, she held several prestigious fellowships at Boston College, Rutgers University, the Schomburg Library, the American Antiquarian Society, and she received her BA and her MA in History and Africana Studies from Cornell University. Kaysha Corinealdi is Associate Professor in the Departments of Latino and Caribbean Studies and History at Rutgers University, where her research focuses on the histories of empire, migration, feminism, and Afro-diasporic activism in the Americas. She's the author of Panama in Black, Afro-Caribbean World-Making in the 20th Century, which Duke published in 2022. That book centers the activism of Afro-Caribbean migrants and their descendants as they navigated the practices and policies of white supremacy in Panama and the United States. Her writing can also be found in NACALA, Perspectives Afro, Radical History Review, the American Historical Review, Social Text, Signs, and many other publications. Corinealdi is currently working on three research projects, just to make the rest of us feel bad about our productivity. A series of essays on past and present day denationalization practices in the Americas, a speculative biography of Thelma King, famous controversial icon in Panama, and a digital archive on elected Black women in Central America. I'm truly delighted to welcome both of them here. As usual, as you know, we disabled the chat and hand raising functions in Zoom out of respect to our speakers, but you can use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen at any time during the next hour or so to pose questions to our speaker. And then at 7:30 or so, we'll start taking those questions. So we're going to lead off with Tyesha doing a quick overview of the book, and then we're going to jump into conversation. But I hope that all of you will join me, as always, in welcoming our guests with the usual silent applause.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you all for coming here this evening to hear me talk. One, I'm sorry that it looks like I'm inside of a submarine or something. I don't know what's wrong with my lighting on my computer, but thank you again for all being here. Thank you, Peter, for having me and for the Gotham Center for hosting this event this evening. I'm really excited to talk about this book, especially in this space, being that it's a book that focuses on New York City history. And I think a really important aspect of New York City history. So the book itself, A Home Away from Home, comes out of my dissertation project when I was at NYU. And I really wanted to focus on this idea of Caribbean immigration in this earlier period, because as Peter mentioned, when we tend to think of Caribbean immigration, we think of this period post 1965, when there was a rightful large amount of Caribbean immigrants flooding into New York City and to the US overall. But I think that this earlier period is a period that is really worthy of being studied. And in looking at my book, in this book, I look at how these early Caribbean immigrants came to the US, formed these social organizations, Caribbean mutual aid societies and benevolent associations, and really use these organizations to create kinship networks for themselves, to empower themselves, to form collectives, and overall to form a Caribbean American identity as well as a Caribbean identity within the U.S. These organizations were really important to Caribbean women as well, because many Caribbean women were able to find leadership or gain leadership positions through these organizations in a period in which we don't necessarily have women in leadership roles. Um, or many places where women can take on leadership positions, I should say. And so, just a quick overview of the book. It focuses on the period 1890 to 1940, looking at the turn of the 20th century and these early groups of Caribbean immigrants who come to New York City. And New York City is the main area of examination for this work. However, it does take a look, like a bilateral gaze, at Caribbean immigration from the Caribbean. So it starts in the Caribbean, how these immigrants and why they come to the US, part of that journey to the US, what they were doing before they arrive in the US, and then once they settle in the US, the next few chapters focuses on New York City history. And so the book itself is about 5 chapters. It's 5 mostly chronological chapters in which I follow this movement of Caribbean immigrants from the Caribbean to New York City. In the book, I look at something like 67 mutual aid societies. I was able to find the records, and we'll talk more about sources, but I was able to find many of the records at the Schomburg Center here in New York, which was awesome and really helpful to the project. And so I look at these mutual aid societies, what they did, what their functions were, who their members were, why they were joining, and then their overall importance and significance to the development of this Caribbean community. And we can talk about in our conversation some of the things that I find really important. Also, as a note, when I say Caribbean American identity, I'm focusing mostly on the Anglophone Caribbean. There, of course, were groups of Caribbean immigrants who were coming from other areas of the Caribbean, but this work focuses mostly on the Anglophone Caribbean because it was in the records of these Anglophone Caribbean organizations that I found much of this work, much of this very rich history of Caribbean immigration. So I'm very excited for this conversation, and I welcome your questions at the end of it. As Peter mentioned, please put them in the chat, and once we finish the conversation, we'll definitely incorporate those.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful overview, Tyesha. This is a wonderful book. If you don't have a copy, definitely order one for your libraries, for your colleges, universities, for yourself. And really, what's quite powerful about it is how meticulously researched it is, but also how much of a story it tells. You really get to feel that you're following people as they're disembarking, as they're making a life for themselves, all within the larger structure of what's going on in the Caribbean and in the US, right? Post-emancipation, Jim Crow, segregation, Black internationalism. So all of that is being discussed within the context as well of what are the day-to-day experiences? What is it like to be an immigrant from the Caribbean in New York at this moment? So really beautifully done. So my, questions and the whole goal of the conversation is to kind of dive a little bit deeper into some of the ways, right, that The book really expands on key questions and also some of the reflections and conversations that you've had. And indeed, for those of you joining us, make sure to think about questions, type them into the chat, because that's going to be also another important and dynamic part of the conversation. So I always like to get started by asking authors about their inspiration, right? What inspired this book? You noted that it is based on your dissertation, but there's so much that goes into deciding to go on to grad school and do a dissertation on a specific topic, get it done, and now your book. So you can walk us through a little bit of what inspired you to think about this topic and then to pursue it and then deliver us with this gorgeous book.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Kaysha. So I'll start with my mother is an immigrant from the Caribbean. She is from St. Lucia, and so her history always was very interesting to me. She came to New York City. Well, my grandmother came first. My grandmother came and left her two daughters back home in St. Lucia with her mother and her aunt and her sister, their aunt, to raise them while my grandmother was finding her way in New York City, setting up apartment, getting a job, and like settling in Brooklyn. And my mother and her sister eventually came when they were 13 and 14, about time to go to high school. Once my grandmother had settled, secured a job and a home for them. And so this idea of like moving from your home country to another country was always something that really interests me. On my dad's side, my dad is from New York, but his family are migrants from North and South Carolina. They came as part of the Great Migration to New York City, looking for better job opportunities as well. And so this idea of movement was always something that was really interesting to me. Also, this idea of Black identity, because both of my family members, sides of my family, are Black, but Black in different ways. And so this idea of how we become Black and this idea of Blackness and what that means and ethnicity was always really interesting to me. In my master's program, I did a master's in Africana Studies. And in the master's program, I was like, I want to write something about Caribbean and African American interactions and ideas and something along that line. I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I knew it wanted it to be revolved around this idea of Caribbean and African American identity. And then I went to the Schomburg. I had a lucky research trip during my spring break, and I was like, I'm going to go to the Schomburg and see what the sources, what the archive says to me. And the archive said, we have mutual aid societies, and we have a lot of them. You need to look at these. And so the more I started researching and finding out about these mutual aid societies, it was like, wait a second, these are really, really important. There are a lot of them. And so they must be really important. And they must have been very key to these Caribbean immigrant experiences. And so the more I started researching about the mutual aid societies, the more I was able to form this project and see the importance of these mutual aid societies to Caribbean immigration. And so really that's, I let the archives speak to me, as many historians say, and form and shape this project a lot. I initially thought, just because when you think of these groups, you immediately think men are going to be, especially for this time period, that men are going to be the head of these organizations. And so in many cases, men were the head and part of the like C-suite of these organizations, serving as president and vice president. But the real backbone of the organization were Caribbean women. Many of the organizations had at least, if not 50 or more percent of the membership were women. Women served on foundational committees in the organizations. And so that also was really interesting to me. And in reading about these mutual aid societies, I was like, wait, Caribbean women were like really running these organizations and pushing for certain things. I also realized that they were more than just social organizations where Caribbean immigrants could find community amongst themselves. They also start to become really political in terms of getting involved in New York City politics and African American politics in general. They had leaders coming and leaders coming and polling at their meetings. Uh, we have members of the organizations running for positions as well. And so I just thought, okay, there's something really, really rich here, and I need to explore this more.
No, I love that. I love how your family was that initial inspiration. I love the
Mhm.
multiplicity of Blackness that you're discussing, right? I think that it's so riveting to remember that you have multiple migration histories happening, right? You have
Yeah.
Black migration in the US, you have, because in the book, you also talk about migration within the Caribbean, right? And
Hmm.
then from the Caribbean to Central America, and then,
Yeah.
to South America. So there are all of these movements of Black folks just trying to figure out how to support themselves, their families, in spaces that are deeply unequal, discriminatory, right?
Hmm.
But are still home, where there's still a place of one's sort of belonging, but all of the institutional structures are so against their being able to actually have thriving and functioning lives, right? So that idea of taking the impetus and just trying, right, and really attempting to create something anew is what's so dynamic and really beautiful about the story that you tell in the book. And as you said, so much of that also connected to sources, right? And like where you find the sources and what they say to you, right? What those sources begin to reveal. And in, I think it's chapter 3, that's really where we get all of that detailed discussion of the 67 mutual aid associations, right? There's some wonderful charts as well, right, to highlight when they're created. For some of them, you actually have the places where they had their official buildings. You have information on who were the leaders and who were not the leaders. And so I just wanted for you to talk a little bit more about, in addition to these 67 mutual aid societies that you were able to find at the Schomburg, I would love for you to talk a bit more about how you use census records as part
Hmm.
of your data search, how you use documents from the US government and
Hmm.
from the British government, how you use the national archives of several Caribbean nations, right, to also make this happen. I was just like, the hopping place to place was dynamic. And part of this is like what you do as a historian, you like go to the footnotes right away. And I was like, where is this coming from? And by the time I saw like country number 5, I'm like, okay, Tyesha was having the research time, but these are great places. If you have to end up having to do some research in multiple locations, this is the way to do it. So yeah, that walk us through that. And then of course also interviews, because I noticed that there were some interviews that form part of it as well. So sources through any of those angles, jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for noticing. I think that's definitely one of the positives of having this come out of a dissertation project is just having time, right? Having time to go to the archives, having time to explore different areas and try out new things in a way that you as a faculty member you're constrained with time, right? I'm on a sabbatical leave right now and I still don't feel like I can do as much research as I need to. And so definitely that was one of the positives of this coming out of this dissertation, just that I had over 2 years to really sit with these materials and to travel to these places, taking advantage of every fellowship that was possible to get research money. I definitely
Yes.
took advantage. But so yeah, so in terms of I would say the mutual aid societies themselves, their records were held at the Schomburg, and not all of them, but many of them were held at the Schomburg.
Mm,
And that was just a key source, having those mutual aid records there. I could pour through those and easily go back to them because it's here in New York City.
nice.
Some of the records I had given to me. Luckily, because I was doing this work and many people knew I was doing this work, I had people coming up to me who knew that I was in the process of doing this and just giving me their family records like, oh, we have these
Wow.
and we were going to throw them out, but maybe they could be useful to you. And so
Mm.
that was amazing. One of my mentors, Irma Walken Owens, who
Yes.
in a way passed the baton on to me. She also was able to give me the records of many of the societies. And I was really, really grateful for that.
Mm.
Um, I knew that this being a project that looks at not only New York, but at the Caribbean, that empire plays a big part of that. And so I knew, as many of us have to do, even if our project is nowhere related to Great Britain, we have to go to London to go to Kew because they have everything. And they do, they have everything. They have all the colonial records. And so I was able to find a lot at Kew, which was really, really helpful. In terms of blue books, colonial blue books, to see what was happening. I connect these mutual aid societies to earlier friendly societies in the Caribbean. And so many of the records and census data for these friendly societies were in these colonial blue books. But then, being a project that also focuses on the Caribbean, I was like, I don't only want colonial records. I want to go to these places and see if there's anything there, if there are any remnants. And so I started looking at really unusual places because they were mutual aid societies that dealt with money and finances. There were a lot of government places that had records. And it was so funny. So in St. Lucia, when I went to the Ministry of Finance in St. Lucia, it was off of a whim. I went with my aunt that day because she was bored and she was like, "Oh, I'll come with you."
Mm.
And so we go to the Ministry of Finance and they're like, "Oh, we don't know. We don't have those kind of records. You should check at the archive." And then she looks at my aunt and she goes, "Oh, didn't we go to school together?" She goes, "Didn't we go to school together?" And she's like, "Yeah, this is my niece. She's doing this research project. Can you help her? Like, maybe you have something." And the lady goes in the back and she's like, "Here, I found these. Maybe these are helpful to you." And they're like records from the 1890s on mutual aid society. And so I'm like, okay, yeah.
Mhm.
And so really having that experience led me to go, okay, I need to start looking in unusual places, not the typical places, and then maybe I can find some of these records. So I was lucky enough to be able to go to St. Lucia, of course, that's where my family's from. I went to Barbados. Their archive is amazing. Um, and they're rebuilding after the fire that they had. I was able to go to Jamaica. Trinidad has an excellent archive, and so I was able to travel to a few of the islands to really see what they had in terms of these friendly societies and any connections back to what I was looking at. So I looked at blue books, financial records, all these different any mutual aid records that I could find. And then finally, I figured I need to talk to someone if anyone is like still connected to these societies. Even if they're in current societies, maybe they have some interviews or videos or documents from these older societies. So I was really lucky to be able to speak with the woman that I speak about in one of the first chapters. At the time, she was 96 years old when I interviewed her, and
Wow.
we sat twice for an interview.
Mm.
Each were like 3 hours long, and she was just amazing. And she was so helpful. She gave me records that she had because she served as part of the Bermuda Benevolent Association
Mm.
for over, I think, 50 years. And
Wow.
so she just was amazing. And so she gave me everything she had. She handed it on to me. And then at the end of our one of our first meetings, I said to her, I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is so amazing. Is there anyone else that any of your friends from these societies that you think I should talk to that maybe you can put me in contact with?" And she goes, "Girl, I'm 96 years old." She was like, "You're lucky you got me." But she was just so awesome. She was so awesome and so helpful. And even some of the pictures I have are because of her personal
Mhm.
files that she was able to give me. And so that was really helpful. Then I spent a lot of time speaking because one of the few remaining organizations from this early period, I believe they were founded in 1925, the Antigua and Buddha Progressive Society, they're still in existence. And so I was able to speak to some of the members of that organization. The president was super helpful, and she provided me with lots of information about their founders, things that weren't available. I was able to get through these interviews. I also interviewed someone from the St. Lucia United Association. She was serving as the president, which was hilarious because I had the conversation with my grandmother. And it's really funny when your family supports you, they don't necessarily know what you're doing, but they support you.
Yes.
And I think I was 4 years, 5 years into my PhD program, well into this research. And I mentioned to my grandmother that I'm doing this. And she goes, "Oh, you're looking at mutual aid societies?" She's like, "I think my friend is the president of one of these societies." And I'm like, "Grandma, this whole time you could have put me in contact." And so she puts me in contact, and just a wealth of information. It was really helpful. So I was able to just glean information, again, by having time, patience, looking in unusual places for sources. Um, I think for me, what was really important, and one of the reasons like I don't write about the really well-known organizations like the UNIA or something like that, is that I just really think it's important to highlight these stories of people who are seemingly ordinary, right?
Mhm.
And their records are not held in the traditional places, right?
Right.
But they're still important and they still like made a mark on this history. And I think it's our job as historians to write about that, right? So
Mhm.
that maybe their stories can be highlighted in ways that it wouldn't have been. And the stories don't die with them.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think so indicative of the kind of skill and attention that you need to do truly diasporic and transnational work and to also do truly community-oriented work,
Mhm.
right? You had to be trusted. You had to, ask those follow-up
Especially in
questions
the Caribbean.
and wait for your grandma like 4 years later to be like, oh, I have some thoughts. Like, the beauty of that, right? It's just so astounding, but so very much connected to the power of the work, precisely because, as you say, you point to people, to organizations, to even events that don't necessarily get as much
Mhm.
attention
Mhm.
and focus as they do, right? And so there's an organization and then one person that like so much fascinated me about the book, but I just felt myself wanting to learn
Mhm.
more, right? And so one was the American West Indian Ladies Aid Society of
Mhm.
1915, which you give us, some really rich information about them. But I wanted to sort of like know a bit more about any particular things that you found that maybe didn't get into the book, a little overview about the
Mhm.
society for those that are sort of unfamiliar with it as well.
Mhm.
And then, I already sort of told you this when we were chatting earlier, but I really want to know more about Elizabeth Hendrickson,
Yeah.
this amazing, amazing figure that is the heart of chapter 4
Mhm.
of the book, a woman that was involved in the Harlem Tenants League, also, I believe, the American West Indian Ladies Aid Society, the Communist Party USA. I mean, wow. So a little bit about kind of those just two to give, our, sort of listeners or viewers a little bit of that additional kind of like in-depth taste of some of these really dynamic people and organizations that get attention in the book.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Elizabeth Hendrickson is amazing. She is a woman who is from St. Croix in the US, now the US Virgin Islands, then part of the Danish Virgin Islands. She comes to New York at a young age as part of this chain migration, right? To live with her aunt. And she becomes really active in American, first of all, in Caribbean American mutual aid societies and organizations. She ends up being one of the founders of the American West Indian Ladies Aid Society, which is a group of organizations of women from the now US Virgin Islands. Um, they form their own benevolent mutual aid society. serving many of the same functions that these other mutual aid societies form, but focusing particularly on women and the needs of immigrant women.
Mm.
It was open to any woman from the Caribbean, but the name was American West Indian Ladies Aid Society. Hendrickson herself is a phenomenal character and just like so admirable. She was literally part of everything. And as I mentioned, reading just like about her, I'm like, I'm not doing enough. I need to do more. I need to get up and like form an organization. So she's part of the founding members of the American West Indian Ladies Aid Society. She becomes part of a Harlem Tenants League. There's a painters like labor union that she becomes part of and serves as like a chair of that organization. She does become part of the Communist Party of America. This is a time in the 1920s and 30s where, first of all, the Communist Party were courting Black Americans and Caribbean immigrants in the US for membership. And so a lot of the progressive leaders of these organizations are all part of the Communist Party, right? So she becomes a like key leader in the Communist Party. I'm trying to think. She did so much. There's so many organizations. I'm probably leaving out like 7 of them, part of the organizations that she was part of, but she just does amazing work. Then she becomes part of this commission that's I believe the commission is put on by the U.S. government, in which her and Ashley Totten, who's also from the Virgin Islands, they work together to write a report on the needs of the Virgin Islands. So she's back and forth between the U.S. Mainland, New York City, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and they're writing a report on what the conditions of the U.S. Virgin Island are and what can be improved and what's going on there. So she really has her hand in a lot, and I think that's also one of the things that we see in these mutual aid societies, that many of the members were part of various organizations. So they might be part of the Bermuda Benevolent Association, but they're also part of this organization or this organization. And so there's a lot of cross cooperation. And I think that's also why we see so much interaction amongst the groups, not only amongst the Caribbean American groups, but we see them collaborating a lot with African American groups. And so they're also participating, the members themselves are also participating in African American groups. So I mentioned Ashley Totten. He's also part of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters. He's I believe, vice president. I can't remember his exact position right now, but he's in the leadership position for the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, which is one of the largest at the time African American labor unions, right? And so he's part of that, but he's also part of the Virgin Islands Council, and he's part of this council, and he's working with Elizabeth in this other organization. And so there's a lot of cooperation amongst these groups to really like solidify what they're doing at the time. And I think it's like so amazing. The woman that I mentioned who I interviewed when she was 96, she was still a resident of Harlem. Her name's Ivy Simons. She was part of the Bermuda Benevolent Association, but similar to Elizabeth Hendrickson, she's part of tons of organizations. She was a seamstress, so she's part of a ladies' garment labor union. She's part of the Bermuda Benevolent Association. She's part of this organization. She's part of that organization. And so we see this is like fairly, they are both very exceptional cases, but in many of the cases, we see the members of these organizations at least participating in 2 organizations. They were taking it to the max. They were doing the most. They were all in like 10 organizations. But many of the women and men were part of at least 2 organizations that they were working with simultaneously. And so I had this conversation with people and like, oh, what happened? Why weren't people? And I was like, well, they didn't have TV, so maybe, and social media, so maybe that was part of the reason they had to be active. But I will say to their defense, these are working people. Many of them are working people. And so they're working 40 hours, sometimes more, 40, 50, 60 hours a week. And they still found time to be part of these organizations, which I think shows the importance of these organizations to them. because they were doing not cushy desk jobs, many of them. They were doing manual labor. They were exhausted, they were tired, but they still made time to be a part of these various organizations. And I
Mhm.
just think that just shows like the strength and importance and significance they saw these organizations as being for them.
Yes, and I think to that point of working, backbreaking work, right? Many of them supporting families in
Mhm.
New York and back
And
in the Caribbean,
mhm,
right? So really not being able to have a lot of just like
yeah.
spending money, right?
Mhm.
Because a lot of it is going to provide for that daughter, granddaughter, son, brother.
Yeah.
And as you make note in the book, it is through women and this sort of female shade migration that
Mhm.
is so crucial to how we get these robust communities
Mhm.
in New York, right? That if it
Mhm.
weren't for women, you wouldn't have many of the spaces where people would meet, the kind of organizational structure, the events that are taking place,
Mhm.
that at one point, they have to, as you mentioned earlier, from half to more of the membership. They're also in leadership positions. And then if they're, Elizabeth Hendrickson, they're creating their own organizations too,
Yeah.
because they're like, we need another one that's just for the
Yeah.
ladies. And so I wanted for you to say a little bit more about what are some of the things that these mutual aid societies provide
Mhm.
that make them so very appealing, in addition to here you're with people that are also
Mhm.
going through the Caribbean immigrant experience. But
Mhm.
what are some of the tangible things that they provide? Because you open up the book and you mentioned susus, and I was like, okay, all right, like this is it. And so I'm like, I don't know how many people familiar with, kind of the very idea of susus and like why that is so important and why it would
Mhm.
immediately, from anyone from the Caribbean, like just
Mhm.
like make you smile and giggle and also be like, I actually know someone who
Yeah.
is in a susu. I'm in one. So talk a little bit more about, the ins and outs of what these organizations provided, what they continue to provide for those that are around, that for you is especially important to highlight in
Mhm.
the book.
Yeah. So, I would say like overall, they provided many different functions for Caribbean immigrants. And I would say community is like the number one paramount one, providing this idea of like a space. In talking to Ivy, when I in, when I first interviewed with her, she said, I came to America. I was 18. I didn't know anyone here other than my aunts. And so the first thing I did, I was part of a friendly society in the Caribbean. I looked for one that was similar here in New York. I needed to build a network of people. And so they provided community and network, especially for immigrants who are coming, many of them young, single by themselves, right? And so they don't have this community. Many of the organizations had visiting committees. So if you were sick, they would come to the hospital, and just having someone there to check in on you and make sure you're okay was that something that was really important, like providing these intimate levels of connection for Caribbean immigrants. The number one thing that they provided, however, was a form of workers' comp. And so members paid dues and to be in part of the organization, but what they got back from that is if they felt ill or if they got injured on the job, and this is before we have workers' comp, um, the society would pay their wages for a set amount of time, a set amount of wages for a set amount of time. And so that was really helpful for immigrants to pay into this. So, anything could happen. Some of the organizations had maternity funds, so they were also progressive, right? In the fact that they know women were working at this time. And if you got pregnant, you couldn't necessarily work. And so they paid a maternity fund for the female members of the organization as well. Many of the groups did. Another really important one, and one that we see that's ubiquitous, a function that's ubiquitous amongst all the groups, is this idea of a burial or funeral fund also. And so this idea of like having a dignified funeral and burial was really important to people from the Caribbean.
Mhm.
I think this comes out of the indignity of enslavement when, people weren't able to honor their dead in the way that they would. And so these organizations were really like adamant that you pay into this funeral fund so that your family could have this money to provide you with a proper burial. And so you can have dignity in the afterlife. And so
Mhm.
we see this amongst every single organization had a form of funeral or like death benefit to pay for your funeral. And so that was really important for these immigrants. Um, and then some of the organizations, I would say almost 75% of 80% of them had a rotating line of credit or SUSUs as part of the organization. And these SUSUs were kind of like an interest-free loan amongst the members. And so they pay into this SUSU. Everyone paid a set amount of money for a set amount of time, and everyone had a hand. So it's called SUSU, but it's also called partner or hand or box. There are like various names for it. And so we see in the organizations, many of the members participating in this rotating line of credit. They could use this money for numerous things, right? There was no limit on what they could use it for, to pay students' tuitions or to put a down payment on a house or to get a car or anything they needed. And this was really important, especially to Caribbean immigrants when they didn't maybe necessarily didn't have access to traditional banking systems, right, in the US, either because of discrimination or because of their status as immigrants. And
Mhm.
so it was a way to build wealth within their community, like collectively. And so it was really, really an important aspect for many of the organizations. I'm trying to think of what some of the other really important functions. I think I spoke about many of the the big ones. And
Mhm.
then I would say also not a function, but also something interesting about the organizations is that many of them had like junior auxiliaries so that children could be part of it, their children could be part of it. And so anywhere from like, I think like 6 years old to 16, you could be part of the junior version of the organization. And I think this was like a really good way of like succession planning for these immigrants. One, to keep in many cases, sometimes either American born or American raised
Mhm.
children actively involved in the community.
Mhm.
And then also so they could learn the ropes of the organization so that they could eventually take over in these positions. And so I think that was a really, really smart aspect of many of the organizations having these junior auxiliaries in which the young children were introduced to these organizations. They ran their own meetings with the help of some elder members. They would run their own meetings. They would put on their own programming. They would be actively participants in the organization. And so I think that was a really neat aspect of many of the organizations. That also was a lot of forward thinking and how we keep how do we keep our children connected to Caribbean culture when they're being raised in the US or have been born in the US? And then how do we keep our actual traditions of this mutual aid benevolent association? How do we keep that going once we pass it on to the children? Yeah.
Mhm. No, I mean, it's amazing when you look at the full array of everything, in addition to everything that you mentioned. I recall you noting dances, right? Fundraising. So they're often fundraising for after hurricanes, right?
Mhm.
In particular parts of the Caribbean. They're also fundraising and signing up
Mhm.
to the efforts of groups like the NAACP, right?
Mhm.
That there are key moments where you
Mhm.
see a convergence
Mhm.
of those born in the Caribbean and those raised or born in the US that are realizing that their experiences as Black folks is one that's sort of like constantly under attack, and that by necessity they have to come together. So you have all the cultural and communal support that the sort of associations are providing. But then there seems to be this, especially by the time we get to the 20s, especially the 30s, as you highlight in your last chapter,
Mhm.
that we see this urgent eye towards the political and
Mhm.
addressing very specific kind of anti-foreigner moments. So I was
Yeah.
looking at 1939 as this moment that for me has so many parallels to what we are seeing today, hearing
Yeah.
today about anti-foreigner ethos. And so
Mhm.
you mentioned, for example, the Reynolds-Starnes bill that wanted to deport all non-citizens and
Mhm.
have them fingerprinted if they'd ever ask for relief. The Reynolds-Sanders bill, which required all citizens to just overall be fingerprinted, the
Mhm.
PACE bill, which would stop all immigration to the US and deport all non-citizens. And then the one that really, left me stunned, but stunned in a way of like, we know this, but you're kind of like reminded of how
Mhm.
much of the present and the past is repeated. The
Mhm.
Hobbes bill, which would establish concentration camps for
Mhm.
all deportable non-citizens, right? So I'm thinking of this 1939 moment. You have folks from the Caribbean, you have African Americans together seeing all this happening, seeing also kind of the immense racial hatred that many are going to be facing from police and other institutions that are supposed to support and provide for them. And how do they, come together? What does it mean to still try to have a home, right? To
Mhm.
have a community amidst such a hostile environment, right? Where you are really being targeted, if not through legislation, through physical violent acts. So
Mhm.
from your research, and certainly feeling open to reflect as much as you can on the present day, but what did you see that was happening in terms of the organizational work being undertaken by mutual aid associations, but also by those links that you're seeing them
Mhm.
make to other sort of Black internationalists, but also Black
Mhm.
nationalist groups at the time
Mhm.
that speak to that urgency that they themselves noted in terms of how to really secure the US as
Mhm.
home for themselves and for future generations.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question and connecting it to the present day, which is always something that I'm thinking about. Like, how is this history secular? What can we learn from it, right? Um, these groups were like super. So I think I would say in the early period of many of the organizations when they first start, survival is the number one key, and that's true of many like immigrant groups, right? Just surviving. Like how do we settle? How do we flourish here? How do we survive? And so survival is the first thing that's on their mind and becomes the main objective. But then as they are not only surviving, they're settling, they're thriving and doing well in the US, they start to like really think about how they can improve the conditions, not only for themselves, but also for Black people in general in the US. Because at the same time, I'm arguing with this book, at the same time that they're developing this pan Caribbean identity, because as I mentioned, many of the immigrants are coming from all over the Anglophone Caribbean, and
Mhm.
someone from Jamaica hadn't necessarily met someone from Trinidad, unless they had worked on the canal together, which we know from your book. Kaysha's book does a really excellent job of talking about that work. Panama and Black. Everyone should get that book and read it. uh, but unless they had been in the canal together, many of these immigrants are meeting for the first, these Caribbean immigrants are meeting for the first time in the diaspora in New York City. And so they themselves are forming community together. But then at the same time, they're thinking about this African American population that has been here, that has been laying the groundwork for them to be there and thriving, and how they can help improve the situation. And so many of them become involved. As I mentioned, they're part of several organizations, including African American organizations that are looking at these issues. In the 1930s, they're definitely looking at anti-lynching laws. They're looking at racial segregation, housing discrimination, what's going on in their schools, because now their children are part of these schools, and they're thinking, how do we improve the conditions for our kids in these schools? And so they're really a part of that. And then I argue that within these organizations, particularly African American organizations, they're also pushing this idea of immigration and the importance of having this kind of immigration from the U.S. I mean, from the Caribbean to the U.S. And so they, in many ways, push African American who were not already, but many were already thinking about it, but they pushed them even more to think about how immigration is not just an issue for Caribbean immigrants, but for Black people overall. And so they're really pushing for better immigration, less stringent immigration laws to the US. And so they become active in, as I mentioned, several labor unions. They become active and people like Elizabeth Hendrickson and others become active in politics themselves and serving as serving in government positions, right? I would say one of the key factors in talking about, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about in the book, I talk about people who are from Caribbean immigrants who are from the American Virgin Islands, and that
Yes.
change from when they go from the Danish Virgin Islands to the American Virgin Islands, and the key difference in looking at that immigration because they already have citizenship
Hmm.
and they're able to actively participate in politics. And so they come in hot. They're ready. For many of the Caribbean immigrants, they have to naturalize. And that also is a process for them because many of them don't see themselves as being part of American society in that way
Hmm.
initially. So they come in thinking they're going to be transient, they're going to come for a little bit and then go home. Many of them opt to stay in the US. And so then eventually they have to get citizenship and they become involved in politics. Whereas it's a different case for immigrants who are coming from the American Virgin Islands because they're already citizens, and so they are already like looped in. And so we see a lot of the political leaders are actually from the Virgin Islands for this reason. And so I think that's an important factor to point out
Hmm.
when talking about not only the ways in which we see this immigration, but also the differences in these immigrant groups themselves, who are all coming from the same place, but have different statuses, and as a result, have different involvements in various political organizations. Hopefully, that answered some of the question.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
absolutely. And I too was struck by that, right? The
yeah,
differences in citizenship status, right,
mhm,
within a Caribbean population, right? So what does it mean now to have this colonial citizenship that also is quite
yeah,
contentious, right? Like what does it
yeah,
mean to be a US citizen in the
yeah.
Virgin Islands as opposed to in continental US,
Mhm.
right? And
And then
we
in
know
the
that
beginning, they're not even sure if they have
exactly.
citizenship. And so they're going through this period. They're like, are we citizens? I think we are, but we're not sure. And so even the US is unclear sometimes in that early period. So, yeah.
Exactly. And so again, illuminating, there's no one
Yeah.
experience, right?
Hmm.
There are so many different factors that are going to
Hmm.
shape how people
Yeah.
are living the day to day, from your status to your
Yeah.
gender, class,
Yeah.
right? Where you live, right?
Yeah.
Who your neighbors
Hmm.
are, how involved you become or
Yeah.
don't become with
Yeah.
politics. Like all of these things
Yeah.
are very much a reminder, there is
Hmm.
no one
Yeah.
grouping. And I think your
Absolutely.
book refreshingly reminds us of that, right? That there is a really in-depth analysis that we need to provide to any assessment that tries to say, well, this is what this group was thinking
Hmm.
and doing, because it's simply not possible, right?
Yeah.
There are tensions as well. And
Yeah.
you're also very clear about
Hmm.
when those moments of tension arrive, right? When
Hmm.
tensions within various Caribbean communities, but also
Hmm.
tensions when it comes to African American and Caribbean communities, tensions when it comes to other immigrant groups that are
Yeah.
around them, right? And they're
Yeah.
also negotiating that. So I think that's really an important component to understand as well. These histories are complex,
Yeah.
and they need to be researched and
Yeah.
engaged with that level of complexity,
Yeah.
taking the kind of time and
Hmm.
attention that you do in the book, for
Yeah.
sure, right? Is kind of the only way that you really can do this kind of work, right? So, of course, having said that, I've got to ask you if there's anything that you wish you had additionally done
Yeah.
in the book, as you sort of consider, the impact that you feel you wanted the book to have or that it is having. Like, are there particular, stories, avenues, areas of focus that if you had, like an additional
Yeah.
year, just,
Yeah.
why not, that you would have added, or it may be
Yeah.
connected to things that you're working on now that are
Yeah.
also building from the book. So,
Yeah.
yeah, your thoughts on things how this
Mhm.
book has really resonated, how you see yourself expanding possibly, if you had
Mhm.
time on some parts or that you're working on now. So
Yeah.
any of those particular avenues. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. It's like you have a limited amount of time. Even though I had a lot of time,
Mhm.
it's still a limited amount of time
Yeah.
and you can't write everything. I think if I had more time, I definitely wanted to delve more into the cooperation and some of the tensions. I talk about it a little bit, but not to the extent that I really wanted to like get into between African American and Caribbean immigrant organizations. I really want to like delve deeper into those like tensions and collaborations that they were a part of. I also was able, in the last few months of my research, was able to find a French mutual aid society that was very active and very like closely involved with some of the Anglophone organizations. And there
Mm,
aren't a lot that I found. And so I really would have loved to like delve more into that French mutual aid society and look at it's French American and look
mm,
at like what they were doing, where they were coming from, their connection to their Caribbean island, and see like what was really like going on with that organization and why they felt so connected to these Anglophone organizations. Because they always pop up in the invitation list. So you see them like getting the flyers, you see them participating, having donated money. And so I really was interested in looking at that organization, where they were coming from. And if I had more time, I would have been able to do that.
mm,
um Expanding from this project, my second book project looks at a topic that comes up pretty frequently in the 1930s in many of the organizations. And so in 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia. Mussolini goes trying to take over the Horn of Africa, and
mhm,
he invades Ethiopia. And it just kept coming up for the whole year of 1935, a little bit of 1934 and 1936. The organizations are talking about Ethiopia. And so I thought it was just so interesting that these Caribbean immigrants in New York City are talking about Ethiopia.
mm,
And so they were
mm,
talking about Ethiopia. And I figured, okay, this deserves not just like a chapter, this deserves its own place. And
mm,
so the second book project comes out of looking at these mutual aid societies and their involvement with the Italo-Ethiopian War. They're raising money, they're holding mass meetings, they're sending materials, they're sending weapons and firearms and all kinds of things to Ethiopia to help participate
mm,
in this war and help Ethiopia fight against Italy. They're also talking about protests and like staging demonstrations against Italian Americans, right? In
mm.
defiance of Italy.
Wow.
And so yeah, so that project, the next project comes out of that, and I'm just really excited. My one of my favorite things about being a historian is research. As you can see, I love to be in the archive. And so one of my like favorite things about being a historian is just going to the archives and finding these stories, finding these average people, and just
Mhm.
looking at their history and seeing what they did and how they were part of these larger movements. And so I'm in the process of working on that second book project now, as and it comes directly from the same mutual aid society records that I
Um,
found back in 2008 at the Schomburg. They keep providing, they keep giving to me, and
that
I'm so lucky for it.
that's the kind of abundance. I mean, they
Yeah,
were, we keep saying that they were thinking
yeah,
ahead, but to
mhm,
really even consider that now they've left this legacy, this
yeah,
work
hmm,
that can be researched upon. I'm sure there could be so much that could be
yeah,
written
yeah,
from those records alone. And you've
yeah,
already given us such a rich introduction, in the book of
hmm,
just some of the things that they were doing. And I definitely found myself very tantalized by the mentions of the support of Ethiopia in the
yeah,
book. And so I'm glad to hear that that's getting some more attention in the next
yeah,
project, because there's
yeah,
definitely what I think is really rich about your book
mhm,
is that it is very much centering this Caribbean New York community as an
hmm,
internationalist
yeah,
community, right? This
yeah,
is one that is very, very aware of
yeah.
what's happening to Black
Hmm.
people around the world.
It's
And
really impressive. It's
right?
so impressive that they're so plugged into everything that's happening. Like we have the world at our fingertips, and there are moments where I'm not even like aware of what's happening, but they are so keyed into what's happening in the Caribbean. They're like sending money for like labor strikes in the Caribbean,
Mm,
for hurricanes. They're looking at what are the people in West Africa doing? What's Ethiopia doing? What are our people in the UK doing? And so it's just so fascinating how like keyed in they are into like these global events and this global news. They really see themselves, I argue, as part of a diasporic community. They see themselves as part of a global Black identity, and it shows in their just care and concern for what's happening to Black people around the world.
Well, that's beautiful and a beautiful way to end what has been a wonderful conversation before we open it up to questions. And I think there were some already that were populating.
And thank you so much, Kaysha,
Yeah,
for really like leading this conversation so well. I really appreciate you for being here. It's
no,
an
of course,
honor
I appreciate
to be in
you.
conversation with you.
It's an honor to have read and be in conversation with you. So, absolutely.
It's a great book, and I will second what Keisha said at the beginning. Everyone should go out and make sure that their local library has a copy. We do indeed have questions coming in, and I'm going to remind people before we start answering those, this is your last chance to get those questions into our authors. So use the chat button at the bottom, and we will get to them in turn. Herman Hall writes, congratulations. Back in 1976 for the bicentennial, I listed those organizations in my 2,200 years of West Indian American contributions. That book has a revised chapter in my upcoming book, From Alexander Hamilton to Kamala Harris. I was a member of the Grenada Mutual Association established in 26. Did you interview any of our members, such as Fred Cadet of St. Lucia? I'm sorry, did you interview? Yeah, I guess the St. Lucia would be part of that doesn't. What do I know
There's a
about
St.
geography?
Lucia Mutual Aid Society. So Fred Cadet was not available for me
Yeah.
to interview, but I did interview Denise Simons or Simpson, who was part of that Mutual Aid Society. And yeah, really awesome stuff. But I did not know about your 220,000 sorry,
There you go.
22,000 years of West Indian American history. But I'm definitely gonna have to look that up. Thank
Yes.
you so much.
Yes. Lynn Frederickson writes, I'm curious about how much representation of the USVI you happened upon and whether there were aid societies before the 1917 transfer from Denmark that dealt with the experience of Danish West Indians in New York City.
Yes. So the organization that I mentioned, that Kaysha brought up, the American West Indian Ladies Aid Society, they're formed in 1915. And so they were definitely members of the Danish West Indians group at that time. But they named themselves American West Indian Ladies Aid Society later, once I actually know they start with that name. And I think it's because they're already in America. That's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Well, we got a thumbs up from Lynn on the screen.
Okay.
Um,
But yeah, there's definitely USVI representation throughout the book.
Great. Anthony Grant writes, Hi, Dr. Maddox. I'm sorry. Thank you for the extremely compelling and timely research. I'm a PhD candidate in social policy. My dissertation is focused on comparing intra xenophobia as it manifests between Black kin groups in the US and South Africa. I'm wondering, how do you see national policies related to immigration and race and/or organizational policies and mutual aid societies in the US as having shaped Caribbean people and African American people as they navigate their needs through mutual aid societies? It's a
I'm
long
trying.
sentence, so I'm happy to
Yeah,
read it again if you want.
I'm trying to think about that.
No
Can you read the
offense,
last
Anthony,
part
but
again?
we need shorter sentences in academia.
Yeah.
I'm going to take that stand right here and right now. Less nouns, shorter sentences. Let's clean up. Let's put an end to academies. No, I'm sorry. That's too harsh. But I got lost in that again. So let's do it again. My dissertation research is focused on comparing intra-racial xenophobia as it manifests between Black kin groups in the U.S. and South Africa. I'm wondering, how do you see national policies related to immigration and race and/or organizational policies of mutual aid societies in the U.S. as having shaped Caribbean people and African American people as they navigate meeting their needs through mutual aid societies?
Yeah. So I guess I would say that the mutual aid societies themselves were really helpful in helping Caribbean immigrants find their place in U.S. society. Um, they were really instrumental in. It's so funny. In one of the groups, I found a book called "How to Be a Good American" that was like American propaganda that was being sent out to immigrants.
Hmm.
And so, but I would argue that these mutual aid societies were showing them how to be good Americans
Yeah.
and how to find their and settle in the U.S. I would
And
also
that's what
argue,
so much of the white groups are doing too, right? It's that
yeah,
period of the, yeah,
absolutely. And
melting pot.
there were
And
also very few. There was very, which I was surprised to find that book. There were very few those kind of like pamphlets and things that were targeted to English speakers, because that was also another issue that many of the Anglophone Caribbean immigrants ran into, that they were not seen as the typical immigrant group that came to the US. First of all,
because they, yeah,
they were black and they were English speakers. So they are
sure.
immediately assumed to be African American. And
Mhm.
there were many cases where they were like, oh, well, you'll be fine. You'll fit in because you're black. You speak English. You don't have the same issues that other immigrant groups had. And
Right.
so these mutual aid societies were really helpful in helping them like find their place in US society. And then I would argue that working with African American groups on these like policy issues were really instrumental in shaping how the community saw themselves as. And I think that's why they were able to adapt so quickly, because there was already this like built-in cooperation amongst African American groups. They were also relegated to the same jobs. They were relegated to living in the same communities, and so they were working really well together, or they were forced to work together. And in some cases very well together. There were a lot of intermarriage amongst these groups, and so the policies I think help that community in that way.
And I would just like jump in because I
Sure.
think one of the great things to keep in mind when you're examining like xenophobia
Yeah,
is to really pay attention to how particular organizations are talking about immigration,
yeah,
are talking about language, are
mm-hmm.
connecting people across like interethnic lines, right? Because that
Mm-hmm.
so often becomes one way of reproducing sometimes that very xenophobic
Yeah,
rhetoric
mm-hmm.
within a group. And
Yeah,
so one of the really rich things that, we see in Dr. Mark's book is really this focused attention on like how are people in this group engaging in specific policy debates. So
mm-hmm.
they're engaging with policymakers, they're talking to each other, they're organizing together because they are affected in very similar ways. Their schooling, their housing, what kinds of opportunities they can
Mm-hmm.
have, their children can have. And so any research that's really trying to both dig into what does xenophobia look like, but also how do people challenge it, has to do that kind of nitty-gritty look at all of the ways that people are documenting it,
Mm-hmm.
participating in it, so as to not, just reproduce a kind of either or narrative that is so, so strong. And you often might see, let's say in the pages of the Black press at this time,
Yeah,
they might just reproduce that narrative. But one of the great things that we see through Dr. Maddox's text is how mutual aid societies at times are challenging that
mm-hmm.
in these ways that are not always evident, even in these robust Black press spaces. So definitely looking at these groups, looking at the press, looking at government reports, like all of those things necessarily have to happen together for a really rich discussion. And congrats on your PhD project. It
Yes,
sounds
absolutely.
amazing.
For sure. Absolutely. Sorry for the dig. I'm sensitive to academies. Um, I've read a lot of it. Yolanda Cador writes, was Marcus Garvey's UNIA modeled after the other associations that are in your book?
Yeah, actually, absolutely. It was not a mutual aid in its typical, it wasn't a benevolent association in its typical form, but it definitely took a lot of the functions and organizational structures of the mutual aid societies as part of their, yeah,
Yeah,
as part of their organization.
sort
I'm
of
actually
quasi
surprised that
business.
all my
Yeah.
questions aren't about Marcus Garvey. They usually are.
Um, uh, well, to your, I mean, to your point, I mean, all the stars of this book are women who, again, just they don't show up in the narrative,
Mhm.
but they're
Yeah.
they're dominant in all these groups.
But to be fair, I do talk a little bit about the UNIA and Marcus Garvey's wife and ex-wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey and Amy Jake Garvey, who are like really instrumental parts of these organizations.
Yeah. Hyacinth Miller writes, I have several questions. So first, were these organizations mirroring societies that already existed in New York City and Harlem?
So I argue that they are not just mirroring organizations that were already existent in New York City and Harlem. These organizations come out of the Friendly Societies of the Caribbean, which I talk about in the book. These organizations were a little bit before emancipation, and then post-emancipation, we see a boom in friendly societies within the Caribbean. And then they themselves are modeled off of West African mutual aid and title associations. And so these are organizations that have been within West African culture for centuries. They brought them with the enslaved people of the Caribbean, bring them with them to their respective places in the Caribbean. And then after emancipation, they use them as coping mechanisms. So they don't call themselves mutual aid societies, but they have the same exact functions. They're called friendly societies. They take the structure of British friendly societies, which were very revolved around financial institutions and insurance and things like that. But the soul of the organizations are modeled off of West African organizations. And then many of the groups, either they form new organizations within the US, or they just bring their whole organization, plop it into the US, and then they name it whatever it was named in the Caribbean, and they just model it off of the West Indian organizations. So in speaking to Ivy Simon, she said, yeah, I was part of a Bermuda Benevolent Association in Bermuda. They had one here in New York. So I just became a member of that one.
I don't know this literature very well. Is that typical of the other groups that we talk about in this period?
Like the Chinese mutual
The
aid
Chinese
societies or
or
the Jewish
Japanese
ones.
or
Yeah, I
Easterns
think
or
a lot of them had. I'm not expert in those kind of
sure.
groups, but I'm pretty sure a lot of them had similar organizations back home, and then they replicate them to
Yeah.
fit the needs of their immigrant groups here in the U.S.
Yeah, it
And
was
they
one of
might change based on how they show up in the US. So I know for the Chinese groups, they're based on like the regions they're from. So like there's a Hakka
sure.
groups and like different kind of groups based on their region or the ethnic groups.
Yeah, yeah. Um uh Second question from Hyacinth.
Mhm.
Was there tension between the groups?
Yeah, they're within every group, within every
Spoiler
social
alert.
human interaction, there are always going
Yes.
to be some tension amongst different groups. But I would argue that for the most, there were tensions amongst the Caribbean immigrant groups and sometimes the African American groups. But I would say there's more cooperation than there is tension. And not to paint like a rosy picture, like everything was dandy, but in the archives, in their records, it comes up as there's a lot of cooperation, more so than tension. I did see a very strongly worded letter from one organization leader to another, and I was like, ooh, drama. But for the most part, in the archives at least, it comes up as like they're really working together, and you see that in them supporting each other. They have these dances and fundraisers, and in all the program books they have like who supported them, like who gave
Yeah,
money, who came, and then the correspondent, and you see them really working together.
yeah,
So I think if the tensions were really palpable, they wouldn't be doing that.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and there are several questions, but how many? Next question: how many of these societies exist today? They're all good questions, Hyacinth, for the
Yeah.
record.
There are three really prominent ones that I know that are still in existence. I'm sure there are more. And that's something else I would have loved to do, Kaysha, to your earlier question. Really like dig into the history of which organizations were able to survive the 1990s and into the 2000s. But the Antigua and Bermuda Progressive Society is one that is still very, very active. They just celebrated their like 100th anniversary and they still own their building in Harlem. They recently had their street co named after their founder. For transparency, I helped write their application to get the street renamed because I spent a lot of time working with the president, and she was like, "Well, you already know our history. Can you just write it for us?" So they're still in existence. The St. Lucia Mutual Aid Society is still in existence. They also celebrated their 100th, or are about to celebrate their 100th, for what I remember. They moved their building. They had a building in Harlem. Most of the buildings that these organizations had, brownstones, were in Harlem. The St. Lucia United, they moved their building from Harlem to New York. I mean, to Brooklyn. So they moved with their membership to Brooklyn. And there's another one. I think it's the Montserrat Progressive Society that's also still active. Yeah. So there are a couple. One of the prominent ones I speak about, the Bermuda Benevolent Association, they lasted a really long time. They were over 100 years, but eventually they just died out. And in terms of the membership, they had members move away. And so one of the reasons we see these organizations kind of losing their membership is people are unable to afford living in New York anymore. And so we see a lot of the members moving away outside of New York. They try to stay active, but it's not the same. We also see like a little bit of a loss of interest in these kind of organizations from younger generations. And
Yeah.
so we see a lot of the younger generation not actively participating and keeping up the traditions, which to their testament, I think the Antigua and Barbuda Progressive Society have done an excellent job in keeping younger members really engaged and involved. They have a YouTube, they have a Facebook, they have Instagram. They're like really like logged in and like checked into.
Transgenerational. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
So
I
there are
think
a couple that are still around.
I don't know if I forget now if you said this already in the talk, but I think you mentioned in the book at some point, and bears mentioning again, um, that during the period you're looking at, association and groups like this is extremely high, right? And
Yeah.
it craters in
Hmm.
the 70s, 80s, 90s,
Hmm.
sort of in broad strokes. I'm not sure
Yeah.
that's for every group, but
Yeah.
there's
Also, some of the functions start to be covered by like governmental, like, and
exactly.
they don't
Yeah.
necessarily see it as useful. We don't need
Yes.
workers' comp. We have workers' comp. Like,
Exactly.
so yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Your book does an excellent job of driving that point home. Not always clear in other works. Um, Last question. Well, two questions, two more questions. Who
Okay.
were the immigrants in general?
Mhm.
And what do you think facilitated the global interconnectedness?
Who were they? So I talk about that in the early chapters of the book. They are everyone. Is so funny when I'm looking at the records because I just assumed, without knowing much about the organizations, that these are kind of be like elitist groups, right?
Hmm?
Upper middle class.
Sure.
But in looking at the application records, we have everyone as a part of it because they all have like occupation, fill in your
Yeah.
occupation. You have students, you have people who are working as domestic caregivers, you have housewives, you have business owners. And so there's a very like broad swath of people who from all socioeconomic backgrounds who are part of these organizations. And it I think this idea of finding community was really important to them in this time. And also because it was a time where there was so few Caribbean immigrants that they really yearned for this kind of connection and community. And so these ideas of like economic barriers didn't play as much of a part. And so we see students as part of these groups. We see um, as I mentioned, domestic servants, we see housewives as a part of the group. And so a little bit of everyone was a part of this group. And even if you weren't a part of the group, similar in the case of my grandmother, she was not a part of a mutual aid society, but she was deeply affected. She went to their meetings. She went to their programs. They had dances, they had church services. She was a part of the organization without officially being a part of the organization. And so in many ways, many of the immigrants, even if they were not able to participate in the organization itself, be like a full-fledged member, they definitely experienced many of the benefits of the organization in terms of the community and social networking aspects of it.
Yeah, and you emphasize a continuity there, and
Mhm.
which is not always true for other groups, right? Like, so for example, like the membership base in like NAACP like radically changes by the
Yeah.
30s, right? And
Hmm.
other groups, National Urban League and others, and but this is a pretty consistent story in the
Hmm.
groups you're looking at.
Yeah.
Um, uh, uh, Lynn Frederickson, thank you for your point about the international reach of these societies. The Caribbean is itself a place in between, and its people necessarily have a sensibility as such.
Yeah.
Um, Fascinating research. Soleil Andrews, sorry if I messed that up, Soleil. I also have one West Indian parent and one Black American parent. I'm curious if you spent any time researching the intercultural conflict that came up when West Indians and Black Americans started mixing.
Yeah, I that was one of the things I wish I was able to look at more in the book. I touch on it a little bit, but not as in-depthly as I would have liked to. If I had more time, I definitely would have.
Yeah, yeah. Hugh Goffine writes, Dr. Maddox, from your research, was there anything that made early 20th century West Indian immigrants a distinctive group in reflection to the post 65 wave? What was the relationship between your cohort and those that came after?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's so funny. Irma Walken Owens, she focuses on the period from 1900 to 1930. And I always use one of her quotes that she says, these people that were coming were often very highly educated, but they had no money. And so
Yeah,
they often had professional skill, professional training. Some of them were coming for school, but they didn't have the finances. And so the difference I see in this earlier group, is the type of people who were coming. And so in the larger group, there were a lot of agricultural programs that were instituted in the 1940s to get Caribbean immigrants to come and work on farms. And so we have a lot of more manual laborers who come as part of the second group. In the 1965, however, that we just see everyone coming in large numbers. In many cases, they were family members of some of this earlier group that are able to come. It's just if I had the chart up, I could show the difference in terms of immigration, but it goes from like I'm trying to think of how many, like 50,000 or like 75,000 to like 300,000
yeah.
people. And so it's just the vast number of immigrants. And so if there was a part two of this book, I would definitely look at the way in which that large group of immigrants coming in definitely change the the characteristic of this group of immigrants who come to the U.S. But you have everyone coming. So I would say the 1940s, we see a difference in a lot of manual laborers coming because of the World War II and the initiatives set by the U.S. government. And then 1965, you have everyone from all socioeconomic backgrounds, just everyone.
Yeah.
Sometimes it feels like the whole of the Caribbean dumped into New York City. And I often call New York City a Caribbean capital because there are more Caribbean
Yeah,
people in New York City than in some islands in the Caribbean.
that's right. Yeah. Um, Cameron Mosley writes, do you see African American Caribbean organizations now compared to back then? How do you see them?
Okay.
And are their missions, do their missions and goals differ, especially today, I think what you're saying is given the different political and social climate.
Yeah, so I would say so the organizations that I look at now, or the organizations, the mutual aid societies and benevolent associations that are in existence now, it seems like their objectives have changed. And not there's no like wrong or right objective for these groups to have. It's just how they see their membership as what are the needs of the membership, and they change with the needs of the membership. And so now the organization, so I'm arguing in this earlier period that they become really radical and radicalized in their missions, where they're like lobbying, they're polling, they're really active in politics. And now they seem to serve more as ways in which to connect around their ethnicity. And so they'll have like cultural programming. and there's a lot of cultural programming. They still participate in giving back to the Caribbean and charitable like fundraisers and things like that. They're really still very much looking at the Caribbean in a transnational way. But I would say the membership of the group is yearning for a connection to culture, to their Caribbean heritage and their Caribbean culture in a way that, because many of the members of the earlier group were from the Caribbean, that they don't necessarily need to do that. And so that's one of the difference I've seen in the programming and the objectives of these organizations that have stood that test of time. Their focus has changed a little bit in what the purpose of the group is. And that might change in a few years. It seems that these groups that have been able to last so long, they are able to do that because they're changing with the needs of the membership.
They have to survive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Uh, Zara writes, I'm looking forward to diving into your book, especially as a member of my neighborhood mutual aid group. It sounds like there is so much we can learn from these Caribbean predecessors. I'm curious if you have something to say directly to folks who are part of the current resurgence of mutual aid work. As Hyacinth said, thank you for this intervention and thank you for this educational and delightful conversation.
Thank you so much for that question. It's so funny. So when I first started working on this project, one in 2006, I didn't really know what mutual aid was myself. And then doing this work, that's usually what I spent most of my time talking about. Like, what is mutual aid? And it felt like no one really cared. And then 2020 happened, and then everyone wants to talk to me about mutual aid and mutual aid societies. And so the basis of conversation didn't even start at what is mutual aid. It's like, okay, what can we do with this mutual aid? Which was a really nice, surprising turn. And I was like, yes, it paid off. 10 years later, it paid off. But I would say that you're thinking in the right direction, like looking at these older groups, utilizing some of the resources that they have, because I think it's really important, especially in mutual aid organizing. It's so easy to get burnt out. And so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. These older organizations have structures that are already there, have programming that's there, and look to them. Look to them for ideas, for help. If you don't have an organization that's already there, and I think that's also really important. Seeking out older organizations that are already in your neighborhood and not just creating new ones, looking to see what's already there. But then if you don't have them, look at these older organizations for their structural influences and use that as a way to model your own organizations.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's, I think, a very fine way to end the conversation and end it actually right on time, which is sometimes a surprise and always
Yeah.
Tyesha, congratulations on an excellent book.
Thank you so much for hosting this for me, and I really appreciate it. And thank you to the Gotham Center as well.
Absolutely. Welcome. Stay in touch. Want to know about the
Yes.
next book? Kaysha, great to have you. Fantastic questions. Obviously, do keep in touch as well. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. We're getting lots of applause. I don't know if you can see the same thing I'm seeing. We're getting
I
lots
see
of
the applause. Thank you.
hearts and applauses. And so great to see that we had some success tonight. And I hope you will all enjoy us. This recording will be put on our YouTube channel in a couple of days. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your night and come back again sometime.
Thank you all so much for being here on
Thank
a Thursday
you.
night.
Thank you for your wonderful work. It brought out the people.
Yeah.
They're like, I need to know more about Caribbean, New York.
It's all
There
about
you go.
it, it's the great people of the Gotham Center's following. I have nothing to do with it.
Yes.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.